On today's episode of Uncommon Sense, I speak with a new member of the Chesterton team, Rob Jackson, the Senior Fellow for the Chesterton Schools Network. We speak about classical education, the great work that the CSN is doing, and the importance of G.K. Chesterton in the classical education movement. Well, hello once again, viewers and listeners. Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Sense. I'm your host, Joe Grabowski, the Vice President for Mission and Evangelization here at the Chesterton Society. And I am very pleased to be speaking this week with my new colleague, Rob Jackson, who is our Senior Fellow for the Chesterton Schools Network. Rob, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Joe. Good to be with you.
Great. So, Rob, for our listeners' sake, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your personal background? What you come to us with a great resume in the classical education movement. So, maybe describe some of your previous work and how you came on board with us.
Sure. Well, sure. Let's pick up with my earlier years in the profession. I began as a college professor, a small liberal arts college in Manhattan. This was back in the noughts. In the early 2000s, and I was sitting first in the Empire State Building and then eventually downtown Manhattan working with young people, 18 to 22-year-olds, who were keen to be liberally educated. They wanted to understand not only what the liberal arts had to offer, but what a Christian perspective. King's was a Christian institution. They wanted to understand how to frame their view of the world in relation to Christian identity. And as such, was entrusted with the education track that we had carved out at the college. I was the educationist, as it were, and there was able to work with scores of again, young people who were considering the vocation of teaching. And in the process of my efforts to recover the tradition, teaching philosophy, history, and policy coursework around education, I was able to launch a number of young people who went on to classroom instruction. Now, a few of those landed in classical charter schools, some of them in private and Christian classical schools. But I was delighted to discover that there was a whole world that was growing, an ecosystem, if you will, that was growing around classical education and a renewal thereof, just really in the past few decades. And so in the course of affairs, my students ended up with one of the larger charter networks known as Great Hearts Academies. And in a couple of years, Great Hearts recruited me to come and serve as their academic officer, developing partnerships in higher education, really for the training of teachers, much as I had done at the college. And so other institutions of higher education have since become partners in this endeavor to train teachers, to prepare them and equip them for classical schooling. And in the course of that 10 years, I really developed a passionate interest in that intersection between K-12 and higher education, and have since begun to work and develop a program really to foster the exchange there, to get more teachers prepared, to equip more teachers in the future, for the future, as classical education continues to grow. Most recently, I was approached by Dale Alquist and Emily Rodstein to talk with them a little bit more about what I'm doing in talent acquisition and preparation of teachers in order to assist, as you just said, Joe, as a senior fellow, because the Chesterton School Network is very, very much in growth mode, exciting times across the network with more than 50 schools. And it seemed good to me, to them, and I hope to everyone on the team to get started in really making a concerted effort and really focusing on how we build a talent pipeline for the Chesterton School Network, because these schools are premised on really having the top quality faculty from across the country. So we have to find them, got to recruit them, and then place them in schools from coast to coast.
Right. And I think maybe some of our listeners are wondering, I certainly would have been if this were me years ago coming to this conversation, what is a classical education? I think I probably, like most of our audience, was educated what, funnily enough, nowadays we call like traditional school, which really is not traditional school. It's the modern, but we mean conventional school. The schooling, my schooling was probably just like the nationwide average of education. I did go to Catholic schools, but they were, we were probably pursuing the same curriculum. So maybe just answer for us, what is classical? What do we mean when we use that term for those kind of uninitiated?
It's a great question. It's a great place to start. We got to define our terms. And classical has a rich history, as I alluded to when I was teaching those history courses on education. It goes back to the Greeks and the Romans and is really suffused with an understanding of a philosophic outlook, which is to say philosophy, the love of wisdom, literally, right? How to develop and understand the human so that they flourish. Now, again, beginning with those philosophic roots back in ancient Greece, we have more than 2 millennia, more than 2,500 years, in fact, of iterations on this notion of the liberal arts. And we've often talked about those 7 liberal arts and how they relate to both language and the acquisition of language and the ability to use language, but also mathematics and the application of mathematics in what we would today call the sciences, which is an exploration of the cosmos. So, if you will, how it is that we come to conceive linguistically, conceptually, the world that we live in, but also how we begin to venture out and understand that world. So, to put it simply, if a liberal arts education is both linguistic and investigative, we're trying to equip the generation that's coming up with some of that tradition that we've inherited. So, we study grammar. We try to understand how logic works within the language. We try to polish and refine the young person's ability to speak and to write as they acquire rhetorical skill. But all the while, we're very much interested in making them sufficiently numerate, that is to say, they can use the symbolic language of mathematics to investigate, to measure, to count, to explore, and obviously in the scientific enterprise, of course, to conduct experiment so that the exploration of the physical cosmos becomes a real adventure that continues to this day. As we know, we're getting these photographs, right, from Webb and other places that are they're just stunning. We want, in a classical education, to equip the young person's mind and their conception of the world in such a way that they're constantly exploring. They're constantly driven by a sense of wonder that there's always more to be learned, because genuinely, a liberal education is for the lifetime, right? It doesn't end when schooling concludes, but rather those formative years are really preparatory. They're trying to equip and excite and create an enthusiasm for that constant and ever reaching for greater understanding. Now, a liberal arts education, which is the term I'm using here, is really virtually synonymous with classical. Classical, of course, references both back to antiquity and the sources, the origins that I mentioned, but it also has to do with this kind of return to sources in each generation. So classic, perhaps in the way we would think of it, when an automobile reaches 20 or 25 years of age, right? Those lines are great. That was really a solid, that was a gorgeous automobile. Well, we're looking for all of those gorgeous examples and artifacts, right, from across, again, several millennia now that have been accumulated in the course of civilization. Here I'm talking about literature, great works of history and philosophy, as I said, but also mathematical formula and theorem. We're looking at scientific enterprise, which is to say the various experiments and discoveries, right, of the scientific project. But music and fine arts are integral because, again, they are the making of things, be it great words in recitations, in poetry, in great speeches, or if it's in fact fine and visual arts, right, where we're making things that are memorials and or representations of the natural world that we inhabit. This whole gamut of activities, from the humanities to math and science to the fine arts, all constitute a well-rounded, well-ordered mind of an individual who's going to continue this quest for their lifetime. That's a classical education, and not as brief as I wanted to be. Sorry, Joe.
No, that was great. And, I think to the listeners of this podcast, I'm sure they're coming from all sorts of backgrounds. Maybe we have parents of CSN students tuning in, or faculty member at our Chesterton Schools Network academies throughout the country. But certainly we have our Chestertonian listeners who tune into this because they're fans of G.K. Chesterton. And a lot of what you've just heard, I would say, should sound, if not familiar, it should kind of ring a bell. It should make us kind of say, because what you're describing is precisely the education from which Chesterton benefited and that formed Chesterton into the remarkable man and thinker that we know him to be. Mm-hmm. And that's not, nothing. That's not insignificant to consider that what we appreciate in Chesterton, this wonder at the world, this ability to, as he says in one place, whether you're speaking about, evolution or the binomial theorem or whatever, he says nothing is irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is true. You can see the interconnectivity of all truth and knowledge. That's the presentation that we're putting forth in the Chesterton Schools Network, because that's, again, the kind of thinker that Chesterton was, but more broadly, the kind of thinker that was formed by this deep and rich tradition of the liberal arts in Western Civ. So,
that's right.
We could see that in Chesterton's day. We could see that by the time Chesterton even goes into what we would call the high school years, he has, the common stock phrase was a little Latin and less Greek, but
Right.
They had it. They had some Latin and some Greek. But obviously something changed. Something changed in the way we educate our students. And now we're seeing suddenly this resurgence. Where do you think that's come from? Why all of a sudden, especially in America, this rediscovery of classical learning, of the classical liberal arts tradition, the great books, the great canonical literature of our programs? Why all of a sudden this movement?
Well, Joe, it's a question that needs to be answered and certainly in full. But the quick sketch, which I think you were alluding to, is that just about the time Chesterton was at his prime in the early 20th century, on the other side of the pond, Americans had adopted, under the influence of some of their leading intellectuals, the only genuine philosophic contribution that we made as Americans, and one that is sort of questionable in some of its outcroppings. Yeah. It's often used, the term is progressive, but I prefer pragmatic and pragmatism, which, it had some players that we could still read with value. William James, in his teacher talks. Before him, Charles Peirce, I think is perhaps, something akin to an American Aristotle with his vision of how we go about understanding and grasping the world. But it was really John Dewey and John Dewey's popularization, which I think in some ways it really confused matters greatly, because he was, in the spirit of his age, interested in propagating a form of education that was scientific. And for the audio listeners, I'm putting scare quotes around that. The notion that you could take education and classroom activity and turn it into a raw science was very attractive to a generation. And I think Dewey gave expression to that. At the same time, those sciences, so-called, were to be applied to society, to the individual, and to the acquisition of knowledge, but really for the shaping of society. So the very notion of social science, which may be 100 years older than Dewey, is kind of an application of scientific method to the social organism, to society itself, right? To sort of programming, if you will, and technologically adjusting the human society. This approach to education, which was focused on trying to essentially modify the society, and of course to bring individuals into that society equipped with knowledge along scientific lines, and with a much diminished appreciation for, if not a dismissal, of the humanities. the humanities became window dressing, right, to many under the influence of this more progressive or Deweyan pragmatism. And as such, I think we probably have seen close to a century of decline of that more humane and holistic approach that understood, as I said at the outset, describing classical, that it is good and fitting for the human to understand their ends. Even the pagans understood this, right? Long before we start talking along Christian and deeply Christian theological lines, even pagans understood human beings have an end, and their purpose is to be fulfilled, to flourish. And to do so, they must become, on some level, to the degree possible, to the extent that their potential allows this, philosophic. They have to be able to know what to ask. They have to know, in the spirit of Socrates, that they are ignorant of something in order to begin to pursue knowledge. Much of that, I'll call it Socratic inquiry, that approach that acknowledges ignorance and then knows that my humanity is at stake if I study the traditions that I've inherited. And unfortunately, much of the modern, what I will just call progressive trend, has been to turn away from great literature, right? To sort of set aside philosophy. Maybe there will be a few that go on to school, college, and graduate school to study those things, but these are not for the common man. And certainly the study of history. I think we've become increasingly myopic and don't look over our shoulder and into our past to understand some of the real drama of the human experience. Those being the humanities, of course, again, under this influence of a kind of scientification, if you will, of education, we lost a great deal. And not surprisingly, with that scientific approach, again, so-called, I question whether it's truly scientific and whether that's really an appropriate category for the nature of education. But under this influence of a change that took place, we've also lost the attention to the arts, which themselves, in the making of poetry and music and drama, fulfills us as human beings. So much of that was set aside. So that's my quick sketch, right, of what I think has gone wrong. But your question had to do with the recovery. And so surprisingly and so wonderfully, somewhere in the late 20th century, probably in the 1980s and 90s, we saw handfuls of communities popping up in homeschoolers, in private academies, trying to make sense of what had been displaced, things that perhaps their grandparents or even they had access to in their formative years. Great literature, again, histories that are recognizable and really soul shaping in some ways, because to read history well is to inhabit another time, is to sort of be transported to another era or epoch, and that is not a small matter. But to study the humanities in full, to study math and science as these exploratory realm, this realm in which we continue to explore the cosmos, and then to be productive in that artistic sense as makers of artifice. These features were rediscovered by these handful, by this sort of as a small set of communities. And I could point to specific schools, right? One that popped up in Kansas under the influence of a group of university graduates who'd been influenced themselves by a group of professors that were really inspired. Another that popped up in Idaho, right, under the influence of a Christian community there, and yet a third and fourth, and I can name several others that probably came into existence somewhere in the 80s, early 90s, when you really began to have this renewed interest among families who wanted to recover something that they knew was no longer being taught, either in their local public school or, as you hinted at, Joe, even in their religious schools, their private schools, or their Catholic schools. These traditions had been displaced, and these families began to do their homework, began to read up on this history, began to understand it wasn't always as they were seeing it right there in their contemporary moment. And then they discovered a handful of sources and authors. Very popularly, you'll often hear Dorothy Sayers in this essay referred to. It's entitled "The Lost Tools of Learning." Many within the classical orbit will make reference to C.S. Lewis's essay entitled The Abolition of Man. There was always a refrain and a kind of a constant drumbeat from someone like Mortimer Adler and his post at the University of Chicago, making the case for great books and great books learning that could continue and should continue throughout the lifespan, right? Not just for kids. But he would make a proposal known as Paideia that could recover this work. That was also published in the 1980s. So that renewal had a number of different sources or tributaries that fed into the main. But classical education, as we know it today, right, as it's come to us over these past couple of decades, is really a recovery. It's a reclamation project, if you will, that's been led by families and by churches and local communities across this country.
Yeah, and the striking thing to someone like me, hearing that narrative explicated, is that, again, for any of our listeners who have ever heard Dale Ahlquist's own conversion story, or Dale Ahlquist's recounting of how he came to do the work that he is doing, which is now the work that all of us who work with Dale are doing at the Society, it's very tellingly the same timeline. He says, we in Chestertonian circles refer to what we call the Dark Ages of Chesterton, where after Chesterton's death, there were maybe a couple of decades during which posthumous writings and collections were still being brought out through the mid to late 50s, but then all of a sudden just darkness, and the books that had been consistently in print start to go out of print, and it becomes harder and harder to find Chesterton except at used bookstores, until right around in the 1980s, when suddenly something, whatever it was in the zeitgeist, started to engender a desire to return to those fonts of wisdom, the traditional things. So that's when Chesterton himself saw his resurgence. Well, we could go on and on about this, but I do want to, Rob, kind of narrow our focus a little bit and talk about kind of the new work that you're doing with us at the Society, because I think already what listeners are hearing should be kind of exciting to them, but I think there's still a fear of entry. How can one wonders how they could pass on what they don't necessarily have. As we just said, a lot of us don't have the benefit of one of these educations, and this is why the work you're doing is so important, to find qualified teachers and put them into the roles where they can pass this knowledge on. So maybe speak about what attracted you to CSN, to the Chesterton Schools Network, but then what you're doing in talent acquisition with us, that's and how people who are listening, who maybe know college students who are looking for careers in education, how they can get in touch.
You bet. Well, it's the work of the moment, and I say that because I feel very much blessed, both in the direction or the trajectory of my professional career, as I mentioned, starting at the college level and working with undergraduates, and then coming to an organization that was seeking to train teachers and to equip its own network of schools. And I did not mention in the outset, in terms of my own story, my conversion, and having come into the Catholic Church after a great deal of investigation. I was doing my own quest to understand better the Christian faith that I had very graciously been given by my family, but which was, as a sort of garden variety Protestant, inadequate. That is to say, I couldn't fully understand where I could find the source material, how I could really identify with and properly interpret Scripture, which I accepted as authoritative. Now, I mention all of this because C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, G.K. Chesterton were some of the authors to whom I turned to explore my faith, to deepen as an adult, to deepen my understanding. And so if classical education was in fact my quest to understand it and to propagate that with future teachers, I found in G.K. Chesterton a remarkable voice of not only uncommon sense, as your podcast is titled, but a kind of insight or wisdom that was lacking in many of my modern or contemporary authorities in education specifically. I taught a number of courses where Chesterton was one of 4 or 5 volumes that I would use to underscore the nature, the philosophy of education, because I found Chesterton to be so readable, to be so accessible, but insightful. There's an adage among rhetors, among orators, in this sort of tradition of oratorical instruction that goes all the way back to the Romans and the Greeks ultimately, where we are to speak of a good person who speaks well, right? That's the formation that we want to provide the next generation, because speech and logos and the ability to conceptualize and to articulate what the world is and what should be, right? There's a moral implication, is so deeply woven into the classical tradition that we sometimes lose sight of the fact that this is not about information processing. We're not just preparing a generation to be knowledgeable so they can check the box or take the test or climb the next rung of the ladder. We want them to be, as we said at the outset, wise in the full sense. Chesterton possesses a kind of wisdom and wit that sneaks past defenses and leaves you unsettled in a good way, because you think, what did he just say? That makes sense of some of these quandaries, some of these questions that I've had, in ways that nobody else, right? Nobody else at the same pay grade or above has been able to put it quite so pithily, right? So succinctly or paradoxically often, where it lands right there in right there in the heart, right? So I have found Chesterton and Chesterton's work to be incredibly instructive personally. Obviously, I then passed it along to students. And when I discovered the network and was talking with Dale and Emily, I just realized this is a remarkable opportunity that families are taking advantage of. I'm watching these schools populate at record rates. The network is simply born no more than 8 or 9 years ago. First school is about 15 years old. But this network, right, is less than a decade, and it's gone from 1 to more than 50 schools. They're smaller. They have a kind of intimate community. They're tied into the parish, right, into their church, their local parish. They have a commitment to a very sacramental and incarnational understanding of the human. So their anthropology is just spot on. They also, of course, are committed to working directly with families. Families are the very first educators of every child. And the fact that Chesterton and the Chesterton schools recognize we're complementary. We are simply coming alongside and working with you. These dimensions, these features, not to mention a robust curriculum, right, and a great commitment to classical pedagogy, liberal arts pedagogy, just amazed me. And the fact that these are high school focused. I honestly believe, having taught the college level, that every year, right, from kindergarten through, of course, is formative. And so we want to give our utmost attention to the developmental features and the ways in which young people are growing. But so importantly, as a young person reaches puberty and beyond, they are receptive to and are being impressed by others, right, with whom they come in contact, whose intellect and character are vitally integral, right? By which I mean head and heart are united in common purpose. If that is seen or witnessed and encountered, and if the entire community, if the culture of the school gives witness to that integration, that wholeness, that flourishing, that is going to leave an impression on a young person that I believe will help chart their trajectory for life. So the high school years are just so incredibly formative that when I saw the model, I recognized everything that I saw within the curriculum and the pedagogy, but I saw this holistic environment, right, that was being produced, this school culture tied directly with family and church. It's a coup de grace. It's everything, right? It's a complete form which I had not seen prior. And so, again, as one who's already been swayed by and drawn into the orbit of Chesterton and his contemporaries, making arguments, by the way, apologetic arguments for the Christian and the Catholic faith that really are responsive to the modern turn, right? The modern turn away from the divine, away from metaphysics, movement towards a raw materialism, even a nihilism, right? So much that is wrong, if you will, with our moment, wrong with our thinking today, is being addressed by Chesterton and his wit and his wisdom as he speaks directly to the heart of this turn away from reality and uncommon sense.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the point of what important formational years, this is the part of our work at the Society for G.K. Chesterton that most kind of humbles and excites me to work with this age demographic of high schoolers. Of course, we want to be of service to learners of every age. As you say, it's a lifelong process. I still am very much a student, and that's, we do this in all our work with this podcast, with our society meetings, the fostering of local societies, the annual conference. But the work we're doing in the schools network, specifically with those of high school age, really is at the forefront of, I think, one of the most important corporal works of mercy that the church has to do in this day and age. Because if you look at the data that have been reported on lapse from traditional faith, whether it be in the mainline Protestant communities, whether it be in the Catholic Church, just universally, those who transition to the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S.
Right.
What I think would surprise many people is the average age of onset of the drift away that is reported among those who have drifted away from faith. And it's 14 years old, right? Yep. It's right there in the middle of the high school formation period. So to provide this stability, to provide this character and faith formation there, and to provide the joy, that's the thing that just radiates off of, everything you see about all of our schools, just that it's not just that these young people are receiving wonderful educations, but they're receiving it in an environment that is just so full of that Chestertonian joy that he said is the gigantic secret of the Christian. That's the really, rewarding thing about that work. So again, obviously, with the growth of the network, the task for all of these schools to acquire and retain the right kind of talent, the right kind of teachers that are qualified to not only provide that instruction, but are also themselves people of character, well-formed individuals who can do that sort of character formation and leadership. This is where solidarity and subsidiarity kind of come right into play in what we do as a network, why the Chesterton Society is of benefit, because rather than the onus of each of these individual schools having to go to all of the college job boards or the conferences and things like that, we're trying to help them out. So maybe just describe that a little bit. And once again, like I said, if anybody's interested maybe in submitting a resume or learning more about the careers available, what would they do?
Well, they certainly can begin, and let's repeat this or iterate on this, but chesterton.org, right? The Chesterton School Network, right, can be found online. And right at the top of that page is a careers tab that they're going to want to use if they have any interest in exploring the possibility of teaching or even leading within one of these academies. But the work I am doing with Chesterton right now is designed to really fill that pipeline. That is to say, in order to serve these individual schools, as you rightly point out, they're working in subsidiarity to their local communities, right? That's where the action is at. And we know that these communities are really seeking out, just as I said earlier about the renewal of classical, it's families that are asking for this. Many times homeschoolers who've been doing this work very faithfully in the formative elementary grades. But at some point in the middle grades and certainly in high school, there are parents like myself, my wife and I homeschooled for a number of years, where we're looking to see if we can't enlist the support and the structure, the infrastructure of those secondary grades, the high school grades. We're looking to recruit teachers from across the country. And we are going to religious schools and Catholic colleges and universities. And we're on those campuses talking to those departments where we can find the right types of teachers. But we're also going to be at universities that are run by the state or that are private in nature. Because as we develop a network of relationships to higher education, we will have college professors representing this work of the renewal of liberal education. And for those students who are Catholic or recognize their Catholic heritage and inheritance, we're going to be looking to attract them into this network. The building of that expansive network, that sort of web of relationships, is fundamentally what I'm focused on right now in joining Chesterton. And I think in many ways that's going to happen in the process of getting to know each of our local communities, understanding that even at the local level, there will be those teachers, former teachers, college professors, those who've been in and around education, who are coming around the school either because their children or their grandchildren are involved, or perhaps they've heard about the school because they're a member of the parish. We're going to be looking to really get the word out locally in order to begin expanding at the regional level. In other words, we want to be able to make those connections in proximation or in close proximity to where our schools are at, even as we try to canvass the wider country. So often, what I have discovered in my 25 years now of working in education is that you'll end up finding a place, you'll end up finding a school or end up teaching. Many of the teachers that I've worked with will end up locating near either their own family or as the result of their spouse's of vocation or their spouse's career, they'll end up moving here and there. And so they will tend to be not too far from that point of origin, that is to say, where they were educated in their undergraduate or maybe their graduate programs. They're probably just a degree or two of separation from where they got that original training. So we're going to really try to get onto college campuses and universities across the country, try to make connections through our own network, the people in the schools who are working to deliver this form of education, to continue to create that web of relationships nationwide. So we're going to do a lot more with advertising, of course, and marketing, both at the local and national level. I think we're going to be doing a little bit more of this. This, of course, is the Chesterton Society's podcast, but I've been on a couple of other podcasts in the past with folks like Mark Bauerlein at First Things or Jeremy Tate with the CLT. Wherever there's interest in classical, and of course, wherever there's interest in a renewal of education, we're going to want to get the word out that the Chesterton's hiring. And so we want to make sure that anybody who's listening to this podcast will tell a friend or tell a few friends to come and take a look at what we're doing and get involved. Even if you're not a teacher, right? You may know one or you know a future teacher. And we want to make sure that you put them in contact with us so that in the end, we're able to recruit the very best to serve the next generation.
Yeah. And you know, to echo that to the listeners, to get involved, if you're just a passive listener of Uncommon Sense, or however you're joining us, if you're not a member of a sustaining member of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, you know, people that faithfully help us out with $10 a month, which is, you know, 2 trips to Starbucks, maybe out of your monthly budget. The difference it makes for us to be able to carry on the work we're doing is so it can't be overstated. It's invaluable, and that work, you know, it has a lot of, let's say, termination points, or there's a lot of teleological ends of the work that we're doing, making differences in the lives of individuals. But I would just repeat that statistic that I referenced earlier about the average onset of crises of faith in young people's lives in the modern era. And if you just think of it in those terms, you know, we all have an account to give one day before our Maker about what we did with the time, the treasure, the talent with which we were blessed. What did we do with that? And is it worth it? Is it worth the investment of your time, of your treasure, of your talent to save one kid from straying off the path? What about 100 kids? You know, this is this is the remarkable thing that we can genuinely speak about doing. We're changing lives and hopefully touching souls. So I do encourage everyone to please share this podcast, share with your family and friends, and get involved and get more informed. We only have a little bit of time left, Rob, but I do want to touch on, this is a Chesterton podcast, and you've already spoken a good deal about, Chesterton's influence in your own life. As we've been talking, I was thinking of a great Chesterton text on this subject, which is the middle part of the book, What's Wrong with the World, book or chapter 2, Education or the Mistake About the Child. And I once met a young man who was an education major at a Catholic university that will remain unnamed on the podcast, but he was an education major, and I asked him if any Chesterton was assigned, and he said no. And I said, oh, you should read Education or the Mistake About the Child from What's Wrong with the World. And I don't know whether or not he ever did. I do know that I never saw him again. I do know that I heard through a third party later on that he had changed his major. So I don't know whether that made any impact on that, but
Love it.
but yeah, what would you say to our listeners about, why Chesterton makes a difference? There's classical is, as you say, kind of a boom market right now. There's a lot of new players in the field. There's a lot of efforts out there in classical, but we certainly believe that there's something that Chesterton brings that's kind of part of a secret sauce. What would your insights into that be?
Well, you said earlier, and I want to reiterate this, his joy, his verve, his vitality, or just that spirit in which he engaged the world, filled with wonder. Never a dull moment when you read an essay by Chesterton. So I would highly recommend, if anybody's unfamiliar with Chesterton, you start with his essays, because you get the man in microcosm in each and every one of those, 2 to 3 page pieces. He was a journalist, right, by trade. Started out as an artist, as you may recall, but then eventually landed himself in journalism. And in the process, I think really refined the craft of succinct expression of ideas. He was just so good at that turn of phrase. His prose reads like poetry in many occasions. And so I would say at first there's just a love of and a joy for life, right? And that can't be overstated, because we do live in a cynical age. We live at a time where it seems like we're always being sold something. And so we're sort of constantly on guard, right? Recognizing that somebody's trying to pitch us, somebody's trying to manipulate us, certainly on the platforms that we inhabit. We just know they're gathering data and working the algorithms and just kind of trying to mind meld with us. And so in some sense, to just be pulled out of that, to pull back from that, Chesterton's a breath of fresh air, right? He just sort of opens up the wider world. The cosmos suddenly becomes alive, re-enchanted, if you will. And I don't mean that in some sort of fairy tale. I mean, he brings it back right there, such that we all recognize afresh, this is a really wonderful life that I've inherited. So I'd say joy and that sort of vitality. But I also think he is, as one author put it, a scrappy apologist. So for those of us who are trying to understand how to articulate the faith, right, in this day, in this age, and given the zeitgeist, as you said a moment ago, the spirit of the age, it's very important that we have at the ready, almost, at hand, those who can articulate this recovery, right, of sanity and sense, in an age where we're often just overwhelmed by the sheer volume, both in the amount, but also in the tone of this metaphysical. And I don't mean to get highfalutin. I'm just saying it's sort of it's materialist. It's just trying to sort of dumb things down in a way that the spirit of man and the fullness of our experience as creatures made in the image, right, of the divine triune God, that's being set aside. It's been for quite a while now, but you get somebody like a Chesterton articulating the faith and making the case, as it were, And you just realize, I've got nothing to be afraid of. Any of the questions that are being thrown out by the village atheist, he's already addressed them and kind of turned them around. He's done like some of that judo, as I said earlier, right? Where you think, wait a minute, that's right. When the atheist pops out with his or her, quick one-liner, Chesterton's got 3 behind that, right? To just put them back on their heels. And again, the sense of which argumentation is helpful because we need to be able to reason even as we pursue the faith. As Anselm famously said, we have a faith that seeks reason, right? That's actually engaged with reason. I think Chesterton gives us just a repertoire of good reasons and great wit to respond to the modern age. So that'd be my second thing. Joy out front, and then an apologetic that's so winsome. But finally, and I sort of hinted at this, I find that Chesterton is truly an artist. In fact, in The Everlasting Man, which is one of the volumes I used to teach, he opens up that volume talking about the cave paintings of Lascaux, right? Talking about sort of when we look at artifactual evidence from across history, we try to go back as far as we possibly can. What are the signatures or the qualities or characteristics of mankind, of humanity? And he says, art. Art is the signature of man because we want to make things, and we want to make things that last. We want to express the soul that is within us. And I think he's truly an artist and a craftsman. I think that's why he's durable. That's why he's going to last. And I think that Chesterton and the Chesterton Network and the society that's supporting these schools is absolutely a place where joy is front and center, right? Where a very winsome apologetic is what we are pursuing with our students. And where ultimately we want to present to the world a kind of sublime and beautiful vision, right? Truly an artistic rendering of what this good life that we've inherited, that we've been given, right? That the Creator has granted us, what it really means to live as flourishing beings. I think Chesterton gets that, but he gets it in a way that is never off-putting. It never feels like he's talking down to you. I can't recommend him highly enough. He's literally, I've got a shelf of my Chesterton right over here off to the left-hand side of my desk. And, he's a go-to every day, any day, for every occasion, a man for all seasons, as it were.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, thank you so much. And, I'll offer my closing thought as this, that our mission here at the Society of G.K. Chesterton is stated as evangelization through education. And Chesterton defines education in the aforementioned work, What's Wrong with the World. He defines education as truth in a state of transmission. Truth in a state of transmission. And the interesting thing about that definition is that it also serves as a functional definition for evangelization. And so you could literally say that our mission boils down to that we're doubling down on truth here at the Society. And that's the truth of Jesus Christ. And really, the everlasting man of whom Chesterton wrote and whom we believe with his holiness, personal witness of life, but also in every page that he ever wrote, he's constantly pointing us towards. And so we're privileged to do this work, and we invite all of you, viewers and listeners, to come alongside us and do this work with us. The ways you could do that are myriad. I would first of all ask you to like this podcast. If you're not subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, hit the thing that looks like a thumb, share this with your friends, all those things that tell the robots that run the internet waves over which this is transmitting that it's content that you like and that other people might like. And this helps us reach more and more people with this joyful, winsome, and beautiful presentation of the truth. So thank you again for tuning in. Rob, just once again, this is certainly not the last conversation we'll be having with you, but it's such a pleasure to have you aboard, and thank you for your time today.
Good to be with you, Joe. Good to be with the network.
Fantastic. And for all of you viewers and listeners, thank you for your time today. We hope you're having a blessed January here in the new year, 2024, and we look forward to a lot of great conversations to come in the year ahead. Until next time, God bless you, and remember, Chesterton is always better with friends.